So I wanted to briefly say that God's presence is not the cure for everything. Things like character and integrity, discipline, those virtues have to be developed and cultivated by the child of God. And the presence of God is not a magical room that we can run to and all of a sudden see those virtues have expression in our life. We're going to have to make decisions to allow the Spirit of God to hammer those virtues out. Sometimes I hear people say, well, if I could just get to God's presence, everything will be all right. And I can definitely understand. I can relate to it. There is some truth to that. But then there are some things that God's presence will not fix. For instance, did being in the presence of Jesus fix Judas? Fix his hunger for money? Of course, we know that it didn't. Did being in God's presence cause Satan not to fall and not to be exalted in pride? Of course, we know that it didn't. God's presence is absolutely necessary for the believer to grow into the full-orbed image of Christ. No question about it. But along with being in God's presence, we have to make decisions to allow the Spirit of God to discipline us and to allow our brothers and sisters to also give their input that will allow us to come into the image of Jesus Christ in the way that God has called us to. I remember the story of the Israelites who went against Ai, and they went against a small tribe that they should have beat, and they lost multiple times. And then Joshua went into God's presence, because after all, if I could just get to God's presence, that'll fix everything. And God spoke to Joshua and said, why are you here in my presence? Get up off the ground, for Israel has sinned. So there are certain things, again, that God's presence will not fix. And running to the presence of God in worship, in prayer, in devotion, sometimes is not that which is needed. Sometimes there is an obedience is required. It's always much more fun to run to God's presence rather than rendering up unto Him an obedience. And sometimes we may run to God's presence and wonder why things are still broken in our life. Wonder why the victory hasn't come. Sometimes that is because the presence of God is not the answer to the problem. The answer to the problem could be an obedience, or it could just be a process of maturation that needs to take place in your life. So we as believers need to absolutely hunger for God's presence, because without that, we're dead. Without the presence of God regularly overshadowing us, we can't really come into our calling as ministers, as well as just children of God. So may God give us the grace, the wisdom, the wherewithal to know when the answer is, I've got to get God's presence, or the answer is, I've got to be obedient to what God has told me to do so that I can reap the rewards of the presence of God. Again, the presence of God, as wonderful as it is, as much as I love it, is not the cure for all things. Some things are going to just require patience. Some things are going to require a measure of character to be expressed in your life. And some things are going to require obedience. And may God give us the grace to render to God all of those, so that we can see the blessing. I think it's in James where James says that you have need of patience, that after you've done the will of God, then you may inherit the promise. James did not say you have need of the presence of God. He did not say you have need of worship. He said you have need of the virtue of patience. You have need of the exercise of patience in your life, so that after you've done God's will, after you've been to the presence of God, after you've done those things that God has called you to do, you can then inherit the promise. So again, sometimes we need more than just getting into God's presence. Sometimes we need to be obedient, and that will bring the answer. Sometimes we need to be patient. That will bring the answer. And sometimes we just need to display the character that God has called us to display as his offspring. And that may be the answer. Sometimes the answer is getting into God's presence. A lot of times it is, but not all the times. And we need to recognize and be sensitive so that we don't run to God's presence thinking that that will fix the problem when God is pointing to another vector of issues that need to be addressed, as in the life of Joshua and Israel when they went up against Ai. Amen. May the Lord God bless you. May he make his wonderful and precious face to shine upon you. And above all else, may he himself give you and your household peace. God bless and farewell.